you so much, Nancy, for that introduction, and thank you for the New Jersey Department of Ed, Rutgers Graduate School of Education, and the New Jersey Association for Colleges for Teacher Education for hosting us today. And more importantly, thank you to all of you for joining us today. We realize that this is a tough time slot at the end of a beautiful fall day, but Juan and I are honored to be here to present a really quick overview of my part of the story, exploring identity in America. As we're doing just a brief intro to ourselves and facing history, we were hoping that in the chat box, if you could provide your name, organization, and professional title. We won't have the opportunity for everyone to introduce themselves, but we thought this would be a great way to see who's in the room with us. And while Nancy read my bio, two important parts of my identity that are not in that biography, or that I'm a lifelong New Jersey resident, and the part of my identity that I'm most proud of is that I'm a father to two children, a third grade daughter and a 4.5-year-old son. So the job I have at Facing History is a great merging of my professional goals, but also my personal beliefs. So I am honored to be here with you today. Juan?
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. It's great to see you all. Thank you for joining us. And likewise, as you've been told, I am the Social Program Director for the New York program team. But really, all that really means is that I'm a lifelong educator. My passion is in education. I've been working in the field of education for a number of years now. I started in public schools, teaching history, and I continue to do that in a different way. Now I primarily focus on professional development with adult educators, but my passion for history is still there. So it's great to be here. So I'm going to actually introduce us a little bit and do the first part of our presentation today. So Facing History in Ourselves is a nonprofit organization. We work in the field of education. We've been around for 25 years plus in this particular metropolitan area. And we do a few things. One, we create teaching resources for educators on a number of content, what we would call humanities content, a lot of history stuff, but also for ELA teachers. And two, we also do quite a bit of professional development. Some of it is in person. Obviously, right now we can't do that. And more we're doing a lot of this type of virtual sessions via Zoom and other platforms. Facing History in Ourselves is dedicated to creating resources through professional development that really focus and highlight equity and justice in our teaching practice. Now, what that means for us at Facing History in Ourselves is that when we are thinking about our educational practice, our role as educators in the classroom, we're thinking about students and how they can all receive what they need to develop their full academic, social, and civic potential. And we'll be looking at a little bit at this idea of civic participation, or at least agency, and what it means for youth. And we believe this is achieved by disrupting deficit-focused narratives associated with students' racial or cultural identities. In a moment, we're going to spend a little time unpacking the role of identity in terms of students and their participation in the classroom, and why it's important for us as educators to think about our students' identities. We're also going to be thinking about equity-focused learning environments and how adults can explore unconscious bias and work to mitigate the impact of historical racism, educational practices, and policies. Now, for today's presentation, we're really going to zero in on this, the component of really thinking about the role of identity and its importance in our teaching practice. And we're going to do that by sharing some of these resources with you that are focused on that, as well as a couple of activities that we're going to do. And I want to highlight also that in alignment with that, with equity and justice, we're also recognized by other organizations that are working in the field of social emotional learning. So CASEL, for example, is recognized as one of the few organizations in the country that's working at middle school and high school level that is aligned with most of the social emotional learning components, teaching. And also ESSA has recognized and endorsed Facing History as one of the programs in the country that is aligned with social emotional learning components. And I think Fran's going to say a little bit about the anti-bias vision report that's come out in New Jersey.
And while this was just released last week by the Task Force to Combat Youth Bias, and throughout this report of recommendations and observations, Facing History was mentioned as a nonprofit to go to in terms of lessons and resources, as well as teacher training. So we're extremely excited and honored to be included in this report, and looking forward to see how this report will be continued to be unveiled over the next few weeks.
So very quickly, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to our approach, our pedagogical approach, because it's really key to understanding how we're aligned with SEL and how we're aligned to thinking about equity and justice. So on the left-hand side, you see what we call our scope and sequence. And it's really, and some people call it our journey, but it's our pedagogical approach. And it features certain, if you will, frameworks for how we think about or discuss topics or content with students. The yellow sort of bucket there, the individual society, is really where we spend our time with students thinking about and reflecting on our identities, our students' identities, but also our identities as educators, also our collective identities, whether it's as a country, as a city, as a community, what have you. We really believe in the importance of reflecting on identity formation and its implication for agency. The other thing we look at is this idea of we and they, this dynamic of we and they that is, pretty normal in most human interactions, but we use it as a way to help students understand history. If you look at history, almost any example you can think of is a history of us and them or we and they dynamic. We help students understand that and also understand that sometimes that we and they can be unhealthy. It could be detrimental. If we talk about stereotyping and othering, for example, that is a form of we and they. And so when we're thinking about SEL, and we're thinking about, for example, racism, we and they is a way that we can help students begin to understand this dynamic, why it exists, and how it implicates our behavior and our choices with regard to others. History, if you look at that next bucket, is something that we believe in a lot in terms of using it as a reference to make sense of our moment today. So when we want to talk about contemporary issues, current events, we're always going to look at what is the historical context for those issues and how can we learn from the historical context to better inform our understanding of this issue today and how it connects to us individually. How is it relevant to our lives? How is it relevant to our own communities and our own choices? And then we continue through this journey. We think about judgment, memory, and legacy. That connects again back to historical context. How do we remember history? What history is remembered? How do we judge the past in connection to the present? And what is the legacy of those historical moments? How do they live with us today? And finally, all of these conversations hopefully lead us to this endpoint what we call choosing to participate, where we hopefully have students begin to reflect on their own agency and thinking about how are they choosing to participate today in their lives, in their communities, and in the world. So this is our approach. We're not going to really get in too much into it because it's there's quite a lot there, but I just wanted to share with you how we approach teaching and content. Now, the next diagram, I think is a little bit more relevant to today's conversation in terms of connecting to social emotional learning. There are three components that we really think are important in our teaching practice and in learning for students. Intellectual rigor at the very top of this triangle. So we need to have some facts. We need to have some information, right? There needs to be some rigor around learning. There has to be content. This is very important. But that alone itself, we don't think is enough. There has to be an ethical reflection component to this. And what do we mean by that? Well, content by itself is meaningless unless we're making some sense of it in connection to our own sense of being, in connection to our own lives, in connection to our own experience in the world. That's ethical reflection. How do we make meaning, right, of things that we are being taught, meaning of information, et cetera. And finally, emotional engagement. We understand that learning is not just an intellectual process, it's also an emotional process. So how can we be cognizant as educators that an emotional component exists to teaching? How can we harness that also in our learning spaces with our students to have more effective teaching? Now, this is our pedagogical triangle, and today we're going to be looking at some of that emotional engagement at the reflection piece of this triangle and some of the activities that we'll do with you today. So for our time together, really, we just want to have a couple of questions to sort of guide us through the next, if you will, 45 minutes. One, how can we work together to create an inclusive, supportive, and reflective learning community in our classrooms? And what can we do to provide or create that kind of space? And two, what role does identity play? Again, we've been talking about identity. What role does identity play in fostering inclusive communities? So what we're going to do now is we're going to watch a video. This video lives on our website, and you'll be able to stream it directly. We're going to put the link into the chat right now. We're going to give you about 6-7 minutes to watch the video. It's only about less than 6 minutes or so, and we're going to ask you to watch it. This is a video of John Amici talking to a crowd and speaking about the importance of identity via his own personal story. John Amici is a British psychologist, but prior to that, he was a former NBA basketball player. And he'll share a little bit about his story and why identity to him has become something important when he thinks about psychology and he thinks about creating a safe, emotional space for learning for youth today. So we're going to ask you to, if you want, shut down your cameras for the next 6 minutes or so, watch the video, and when you're finished watching it, you can put your cameras back on and let us know you're done. Thank you.
Identity is not just self-revelation. It's not just something you come to know about yourself. It's also, in part, made up of how other people see you and how you see yourself in other people. They call this a very old-fashioned
Okay, if you're done watching the video, we'd love to have you come back and let us know by putting on your camera. Thank you. Great, thank you, George. Welcome back. Hey, Donna, thank you. Welcome back. Olivia, welcome back. Thank you. We'll just wait for just 30 more seconds. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I just want to emphasize what John Amici was sharing with us in this video via his own personal story. And we really believe at Facing History in Ourselves that when we're thinking about social emotional learning, it is about creating this emotional space where students feel valued, where they can be who they are, their identities can be shared, where they can reveal things about themselves without risk of derision, without fear of being marginalized, where it is truly a space that feels inclusive and welcoming. And we believe also that without that as the foundation for your classroom, doing the rest of the content and the learning is going to be much more challenging. We think this is the first thing. This is the first priority. Creating a space where students feel that they're valued, that they're at the center of that learning experience, that they're there, they feel that you care about them, they're going to be heard, and they can be who they are. And this is the importance of identity. And we believe that this is central to effective teaching. So moving ahead, how do we do that? Well, one of the ways that we can do this is via a strategy we call contracting. Now, contracting is different from creating rules for the classroom. If you create rules, the teacher creates the rules, and then you tell the students, these are the rules, and if you break them, there are penalties. Contracting is different. Contracting is about having a conversation with your students and inviting them to co-create what those rules are going to be or how they're going to engage in learning together as a community. So again, contracting, how can we make a safe and reflective classroom? And that's what contracting is about. And we have contracted because we anticipate that there may be times where there are going to be some conversations that are going to be challenging or difficult. And so we want to make sure that we have some protocols in place that all of us agree to together about how we're going to engage in those conversations, how we're going to navigate those moments that can be difficult, that can be uncomfortable. And that's what contracting is about. So contracting, as I said, is a strategy for making your classroom a reflective community. And we, at Facing History, we emphasize a lot of reflection and journaling, for example, giving students the opportunity to think and reflect in private ways and in public ways. It's a place where we have explicit rules and implicit norms about protecting everyone's right to speak, where there can be different perspectives that can be heard and valued, and where members take responsibility for themselves and each other as a whole group, and where each member has a stake, and again, a voice in the collective decisions that are made by the community. That is what contracting is. So we're going to turn it to you just for a quick little sharing. What would be some norms that you feel are important for everyone in a class, on a team, or as a member of a school community to follow so that we can all voice our ideas, ask the questions we want to ask, and be heard by others? So feel free to just type in some things into the chat around some norms that you think would be important if you were to do a contract with your classroom or your community. And we'll just take a couple of minutes to see and share a little bit in the chat. Great, Megan, thank you. Agreeing that it's okay to not agree, hearing each other out, believing out that they are different truth. This is so important today, Megan, I really appreciate that. We live in an incredibly polarized time, and so we have to, I think, a first step in the right direction would be to acknowledge that there are different perspectives out there. And so we need to acknowledge that and then move and hopefully be willing to listen to those different perspectives, even when they challenge some of our own thinking. no judgment. Tori, thank you for that. This is an important one. I think that we don't want to be judgmental, and we don't want to, especially with students, because we know that as a teacher, if you allow other students to critique other students openly, that could shut down a student. However, we do want to make sure that there's a way that we can discuss and challenge ideas, not necessarily the person. So there may be ideas that we don't agree with, and we think that should be called out as incorrect or false. But we need to be able to do that in a safe way, do that in a way that doesn't diminish the person, but the idea. And so that's what contracting is. You create some norms around how do we have those moments where we can debate, challenge, and disagree in a way that feels still like we're honoring and respecting each other. Open to challenging the mindset, normalizing, asking for help, and being open to help others, absolutely. Part of what we're trying to do is create a community, and so that means being in support of each other. We should be in the spirit of learning together. No put downs, and exhibit respect. Show compassion. Yes, compassion is a big one, and it's part of what we believe in too. That goes back to that emotional engagement piece where we want to think about empathy. So here's a scenario very quickly around what contracting could look like if you were going to do this in a classroom. It's just a sample. This is something that students could create together, right? And so you can see there, I'm not going to go and read them all, but again, this is just a way to get students to share with you together, think collectively around what are you going to do when a certain moment or occasion arises in your classroom where you want to share something, right?
And
So
these sample scenarios are taken from our Back to School 2020 toolkit. And the important thing to recognize is that when these were created, it tried to address the remote learning community, as well as the in-person, or if you have a blended in-person and remote opportunity, to make sure that all students, regardless of where they physically are having a voice in the contracting.
Thank you, Frank. Very important. And finally, for us, we have still about 30 minutes left to do an activity with you from one of our resources. So we want to propose a little bit of contracting for us as we engage in that activity and actually have a time to talk with each other. So, here are some of the ones that we often put up. Listen with intention, really be present, and listen to your partner or the group when we're sharing. Challenge ideas, but not people. Again, this is really important. Make sure that you're sharing time to talk, right? So there's a lot of us on the call and you want to give other folks a chance to have a voice. Avoid generalizations like I statements, affirm others, be honest and thoughtful, work through discomfort. Used to be a time we used the word dissonance. Now we're using the word discomfort. We think that discomfort is not necessarily a bad thing. So how do we work through it? Constantly learn and be reflective. So this is what we propose for us as we go through the next 30 minutes or so. So thank you, and I'm gonna turn it over to Frank to continue us and get us into the actual activity where you'll be engaging in some more conversation.
Thanks, Juan. And we realize that this is an extremely short period of time that we have together. So the activity that we're going to be doing is a small component of the My Part of the Story Exploring Identity in the United States unit. This is available in paper copy, but also as a PDF on our website, and I'll share the link after we conclude the activity. This is available if you just need to create a free account on our website. As with all our resources, which include streaming videos, you'll be able, and your students will be able to have access to them. So to briefly introduce the unit and the guide, there's 6 key lessons to the My Part of the Story guide. Starting with, as Juan talked a lot about, finding your voice and why that is such an important aspect of having an inclusive voice in our classrooms today. The second lesson deals with identity and names, and looking at how they're linked and what they represent in a person's life. Lesson 3 focuses on identity and labels, looking at how labeling, stereotyping, and assumptions can be used to identify each other in certain cases, as Juan mentioned before, leading to the we and they concept and a marginalized group within our communities. The lesson that we're going to look at today focuses on identity and choices, but it also goes past to connecting to the past and looking at what it means to have a national identity. During this, the students' key understandings are that identity is dynamic, complex, and personal, and it affects both how we see ourselves and also how we interact with others. Our environment influences how we understand ourselves and others, and the identity of a nation like the United States is a product of collaboration and conflict between a variety of individual voices and groups. Linking together what was mentioned before, the social, emotional, academic development, we also see the need to include skills, so citing specific textual evidence to support analysis of primary and secondary sources is built into this unit. Compare and contrasting treatments of the same topic in several primary and secondary sources, so looking at the lens of perspective, and making connections between history and literature they study and their current lived experience. So the activity that we're going to look at is that you will have an image shared with you. We ask that you study the image and think about what assumptions might be made about the person's identity. There's going to be a link placed in the chat box in which you can input 3 of your assumptions about the image that we're going to be looking at. So in the chat box, if your last name is between the letters A and L, please follow the link that was provided to you. And if your last name is between M and Z, please follow the second link. And just like we did with the video, we'll give you about 5 minutes to go through this activity. So if you could turn off your video now, and then when you complete the activity, turn it back on so we have an indication of when you're done, that would be great. If anybody has any troubleshooting issues with the links provided, please let us know and we'll be happy to walk you through it. Okay, maybe we're gonna give another minute or two to wrap this up and then I'll share my screen with the results. Okay, let me reshare my screen. Okay, so this was from group one. Does anybody, would anybody from A through L mind unmuting and kind of discussing some of the feedback or comments that you put into the Mentimeter poll? No pressure. Juan and I were talking before that unmuting on a Zoom conference is now like the students who are asked to raise their hand and participate in a full school assembly. So no pressure to unmute. But as you can see, one word that has been inputted into the results because it's larger than the others is angry. So we see angry, we see words like athlete, male, racist, violent, younger, unemployed, countercultural, white, quiet, and resistant to help. So that was the image from the first group slide. With the second, would anybody from M to Z like to give a little summary before I share?
I went with my first reactions from visually, just looking at him in terms of, I guess, skin color and gender. So I put he was a white male, and I assumed by what he was wearing that he might be middle class, just based on what he was wearing.
Thank you, Olivia. And then we see a variety of words or phrases in here as well. White supremacist, protester, Southern, middle-class college student. It's very interesting to see the variety of words or associations just by looking briefly at the image we looked at. So as I go back to present our slide here, I would like to share with you the two images that you looked at. For group one, this was the image that A through L looked at. This is the image from M to Z. Does anybody have any quick observations going between the two images?
This is Charlene. So can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. So I'll share. Yeah, as Megan said, it looks like they're the same person. But one of the things that stood out to me is I think I would still pick the same words to describe the person, despite some of the changes to their outfit.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you, Megan and Tori, as well for putting your comments in the chat. So we only had time to look at two of the images today, and these are the rest of the images from the collection. How we would do this in person with a group of students or educators, would we put each image on a big paper, and we'd have like a silent conversation with groups putting comments like you did in the Mentimeter, and then having groups rotate and respond to some of the comments and look at other comments. As you can see, it is the same person in a variety of outfits with the same facial expression. And this is taken from a series, photo essay series called Our Kind of People. And these are some other examples taken from the guide that show the same individual in a variety of different outfits. To reflect on the activity and on the photo essays, the Our Kind of People series examines how clothing, race, ethnicity, gender, and skin tone affect our ideas about identity, value, and character. The subjects in this work are dressed in clothing from their own wardrobes. The outfits are worn in a style similar to how a person would wear them in daily life. The lighting and facial expressions have been kept the same in each photograph. The only change from image to image is the clothing, gender, and race, ethnicity of the person in the photograph. Devoid of any context for assessing the personality of an individual in the photograph, the viewer projects her or his own cultural biases onto the image. Though not strictly documentary, these images are nonfiction in that you could encounter any of these people looking like any one of these alter egos on any given day. So to debrief the activity that you just did and looking at, I know we are scheduled to have some time for question and answers today too. I'm curious, is that something that, how would your students, how would your staff, how would your colleagues react to an activity like that? Would it be meaningful into the community, the school community that you work in? And to kind of explore equitable mindsets and practices, I'm going to put a link to a Google Doc in the chat. And Juan and I would be really interested in hearing, as we said, this is an extremely quick introduction to this activity. So we did want to give you a sampling of a portion of the lessons in it. But in what ways are you reflecting on identity in classroom communities? How are these activities impacting your thinking about your practice and the schools and systems in which you and your students operate? And what might you want to learn more about? We're really curious to hear your answers to those reflective questions. And right now I'm going to put in the chat the link to the 6 units in my part of the story. Which I realized didn't necessarily copy the easiest to read, so I'll read. Oops.
I just put them in the chat, Frank.
Thanks, Juan. So as we conclude today, we realize that we have about 8 minutes left, and Juan and I are here if you have any questions about this resource or any of our other resources. We'd be more than happy to engage in a dialogue with you.
I have a question about implementation of like similar activities.
Sure.
Since most of the teaching or education force is primarily white females, in terms of implementing these kinds of activities, do you think, or what are your thoughts on, finding someone internally to do the best they can, or finding someone outside of the organization who might be from a diverse background to try to implement activities? Or do you think that's critical or not critical? Hopefully that question makes sense. If not, I can try to rephrase it.
Could you rephrase that a little bit? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So in activities that are encouraging you to explore, your assumptions of others and your own identity, if the person presenting, how critical is the identity of the person presenting, considering most of this, our field is white female educators, and that's not necessarily the demographics of our students.
Great. Frank, you want to answer, or I can jump in?
You could go first, and then, or do you want me to go first, and then you could add? Up to you, Juan.
Yeah, no, this isn't a great. By the way, what's your first name?
Charlene. I'm using my jobs account if they have unlimited.
Charlene, you're good. No, good to know your name. Charlene, that's a really great question, and I'm going to be very honest and transparent. I think that even as we do this kind of work as facilitators, we've come to the conclusion that it's very important to consider the identity of the facilitator or the instructor or the teacher when doing these kinds of activities with students. And what we mean by that, for example, when we try to do these types of professional development sessions, we try to have representatives from different ethnic backgrounds if possible, right? We think that that is important for a number of different reasons. We think that the more diversity that you can have among staff, for example, we think is incredibly important, whether you're a teacher, whether you work in an office, what have you, to be able to see different identities in these roles is incredibly important for students, for staff, for employees, et cetera. But beyond that, also we would say that being reflective on our own identities also is incredibly important. So we're all bringing identities to these conversations. So whether I'm a Hispanic, Latino, whatever, Latinx, male, or you're white, or African American, or you're Asian, whatever it is, you're bringing that identity into this conversation. And so it's important to recognize that, and it's important to be transparent about that when you're having these conversations. So that goes back to the importance of identity and really collectively having a conversation, acknowledging that we have these components that are part of the mix and how we see the world and how we navigate the world and how we're going to have these conversations.
And I think building off of that, we all bring to the table our individual identities. And we spend a lot of time as educators focusing on recognizing what that looks like for the students in our classrooms. It's equally important, I think, to look at the identity of the adults who are teaching these students and what expertise they have and what shared experiences they have, but also what experiences they might not have. I know my individual identity is very different than a lot of other people because unlike in John Amici's video, I did see myself represented in a lot of the teachers and my colleagues that I have. So that is something, a part of my identity that I recognize allowed me certain privileges to go through my school system. And I realized that also that not everyone has those shared experiences. So how can we foster a dialogue that looking at our individual experiences, but extended to look at what does it mean to provide. And one of the areas that we didn't have time to go into is looking at how John Amici says, without safety, there's nothing, but how do we create these brave spaces in our classrooms and in our educational communities? And how do we get a starting point on these conversations about identity with the educators in the room? And sometimes we recognize that involves giving up a small bit of safety to put yourself out there bravely and to start that conversation. So I don't know if that specifically addressed some of the content of your question, but it is something that we talk about a lot and looking at when we do go facilitate in school communities, especially on topics related to race.
I will say it definitely does, especially that last portion that you mentioned, because I know even for myself, sometimes I never feel 100% ready or 100% confident to lead conversations, but it's all about acknowledging your background and that we're all doing the best we can. And part of that comes with the norming, right? If we're all norming that we're coming from a place of trying to do better, sometimes you do have to be vulnerable, even if you don't feel 100% ready.
And that what you just touched on, I think, is a great summary of the poem, A Brave Space. I'll try to look for it to put it in the link real quick, but it talks about that sense of vulnerability that sometimes we have to recognize as educators, we always want the perfect lesson, that we want the class to go perfectly. But it also recognizes that we're not always going to be perfect, that sometimes that we're going to try something and it's going to fail. But how in that space together do we recognize that even though it failed, we're still here to learn together, that it's still our shared community and it's still something that we're constantly working on improving. And thank you, Juan, for putting that in the link.
Any other questions or comments? We'd love to hear from you.
I am going to share real quick, Juan and I, the last slide of our presentation is just our contact information. If anybody does have questions for us offline, we'd be thrilled to talk with you. And once again, even though we said this at the beginning, Juan and I, thank you for being here today. We know it's not always easy to participate in difficult conversations about topics centered around identity and race. So we really appreciate you participating in the activity, for your questions, your comment in the chat. Hopefully we'll be able to be in touch after this conference, but thank you for the service to your communities, to the students that you reach, and also to your colleagues. We hope everybody has a wonderful day, and thank you again for joining us. Thanks, Nancy, for hosting us on your platform.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. Don't forget to complete the evaluation form, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you to Juan and Frank. Bye-bye.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Have a great day.